Hello, class. Welcome back. Today we are beginning with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's another very major thinker because he's in some sense at the crossroads, and he opens up avenues for new modes of thinking within the context of the Enlightenment, especially about politics. So Rousseau is born in Geneva. He's a citizen of Geneva. Geneva is one of the small city republics that still exist. It's surrounded by absolute monarchies all around him. So he is definitely committed and is proud of the fact that he's a citizen of Geneva. In fact, if you notice the assignment for today, the discourse is on the origins of inequality. It has a dedication, and the dedication is to the Republic of Geneva. And in fact, he views Geneva as this kind of oasis, if you will, of a kind of society that he wants to aspire to, right? That he wants to recreate. As he says in the dedication, may a republic so wisely and so happily constituted last forever, both for its citizens' happiness and as an example to all peoples, as an example to all peoples. And that's partly his political ambition. Again, like I said, he's surrounded at this time, Geneva is surrounded by absolute monarchies. And that is something he finds detestable. So his whole normative political philosophy is aimed at a kind of recovery of a republican tradition. In this sense, he's very close to Machiavelli, and I'll try to make the case for why that is. But he's also a very controversial figure himself. As a human being, he almost always has managed to ruin his relationships with famous intellectuals. He moved to Paris in 1750. He was exiled from Geneva. He also had to then flee France at some point. Regardless of his controversial personal life, he was also a very powerful intellectual. In 1755 is when he wrote the second discourse. Now, he has two discourses. The first one is called the Discourse on Arts and Sciences. And the second one is the one that we are reading, Origins of Inequality. Both of them were actually essays that he wrote for a competition organized by the Academy of Dijon. And for the first essay, he actually received the first prize. He was the winner of the competition. This one did not win the competition, but nonetheless, it became very influential. And it has a important argument here that Rousseau will develop more in the social contract, which we read tomorrow. So Rousseau is central in this course because he is both, of course, a member of the Enlightenment. He is part of the Enlightenment tradition, but he also represents a certain kind of critical reflection of the Enlightenment. He's somebody who is, in some sense, disputing a belief that Enlightenment represents a certain kind of progress, right? To refer back to the first reading of Kant, that Enlightenment represents the escape of humans from a self-incurred immaturity, right? And Rousseau wants to contest that. So his whole style of writing involves a certain kind of social criticism. He's looking at the society around him. He's not happy with the state of humanity. And he wants to locate the problems, in fact, at some of the things that have been cherished as part of the progress of enlightenment. Okay, but he's also a very tricky thinker. He writes paradoxically. He formulates many paradoxes in his argument, and hence he's also subject to a lot of different and varied interpretations. Some view him as the ideologist for the French Revolution. And he also is in some sense influential in shaping the Romantic intellectual tradition. Some have even argued that he's a kind of totalitarian. So there are varied interpretations about Rousseau. I'll, of course, provide you with my interpretation, which I think is valid, and I'll try to argue for that based on the reading. But let me say a few words about the context and how he fits in with the rest of the course. So far, we have encountered two accounts, which are again in line with the kind of Enlightenment tradition, a certain kind of scientific understanding, attempted at a certain kind of scientific understanding of the political world. And this requires, it involves the assumption that human beings come together and rationally try to construct a social order, all right, for the purposes of something better. Okay. For Hobbes, again, you have individuals who are perpetually in a state of nature that is a state of war with each other. Then they decide to constitute a political community governed by a sovereign, and the people are, in Hobbes' account, obliged to obey because the sovereign gives them security and peace, right? For Locke, it does not go to the extreme of Hobbes. For him, the state of nature is this kind of idealized realm where there is some kind of reciprocity, mutual recognition of each other's rights, and a kind of harmonious state. But nonetheless, there are inconveniences which open the door to the need for a kind of political society governed by a sovereign. Nonetheless, what Locke achieves is opening the door to questions about legitimacy. That is, the people, the subjects of a particular state, have within them always the right to question authority, and if possible, dissolve authority if the authority becomes tyrannical, right? So Locke opens the door to questions about consent and legitimate rule, right? So this is, in some sense, the trajectory we're following, that politics is going from the absolute authority of the sovereign power to certain kind of contestation and scrutiny and questioning from below, right? That the real source of power is in the political community itself. And this is largely the line Rousseau, I would say, takes the next step, in that he wants to invert the kind of Hobbesian picture we have, right? He wants to invert the relationship between freedom and obedience, and he also wants to ground the necessary relationship between freedom and community, right? That really what makes people free is that as a community, they're able to give laws to themselves, right? So his political philosophy is aimed at establishing the conditions of possibility for both freedom, political freedom, and community. In that sense, he's closer to Machiavelli of the Discourses, right? Let me clarify what I mean here by freedom. A very famous thinker of the 20th century, Isaiah Berlin, makes a distinction between negative liberty and positive liberty, right? If you recall, when we read Hobbes, we encountered a conception of liberty, and it says it's motion that is unimpeded, right? Motion that is not stopped by anything else. That's, again, a very kind of physical sense of the term. If an object is in motion and it's not obstructed, then they are free. That is, they're simply have inertia, they can maintain their movement. And for Locke, obviously, that is formulated in terms of your property, your life, your liberty, and your possessions. That having those things is what constitutes your, in some sense, your freedom. And both accounts, the sovereign power's aim and goal is to make sure that liberty in that narrow sense is preserved. So the issue here is, for both Locke and Hobbes, liberty is conceived of as a kind of negative liberty. That is, a freedom from, for Hobbes, death and destruction in the state of war, of all against all, and for Locke, freedom from incursions and invasions into your property. That is, you're free to do whatever you want as long as you do not face always the specter of death around the corner, or the specter of expropriation of your property, right? The other conception of freedom is a certain kind of positive freedom. That is, not only are you protected from certain things, not only do you have protections, but you are also actively, in a way, able to shape and determine the conditions of your life. So just as a freehand, I would make the distinction between liberty and autonomy. Right? Autonomy is the notion It comes from the Greek autonomos. So you give a rule to yourself. That's the conception of positive freedom, that you not only are protected from dangers, your rights are not only protected, but in some sense, you are the author of the rules according to which you live. So Rousseau is strictly in this kind of positive freedom tradition. He's trying to give you a Republican account of politics, which is principally concerned with freedom in this more active and positive sense. So let's now enter into the text. Now, Rousseau will try to do something very interesting in this second discourse. He has to obviously follow Hobbes' structure. Hobbes, in this sense, is definitive because he's laying out the broad framework about thinking about politics, that one has to begin with the state of nature. And this much even Rousseau accepts. Okay, but he's going to be more, in a way, I think, convincing, because what he wants to do is both argue for a conception of the state of nature, but he's trying to be very consistent about how one can even derive and understand the state of nature. Okay. So he begins the preface to the second discourse. I'm now reading from page 124. He says, the most useful and least advanced of all human knowledge seems to be that of man. Right? And I dare say that the inscription on the temple of Delphi alone contained a more important and more difficult precept than all the big books of the moralist. So the inscription on the temple of Delphi is know thyself. Right? Know thyself. So human self-knowledge has to be the most fundamental knowledge that one should try to acquire. But it is the least advanced, he says. So everybody who has now been writing about human nature, Hobbes, Locke, he says they have not really made any progress. And he says that there is a serious difficulty in actually accessing human nature in its pure form, right? In its pure form. Why is that? Because implicitly he believes that human nature is something that changes over time. So humans, this is he draws a comparison with the statue of Glaucus. This is a statue that was weathered by storm, and it transformed. Glaucus was a god, and this statue of Glaucus became transformed into something really quite ugly and hideous. Right? So he says, like the statue of Glaucus, which time, sea, and storms had so disfigured that it less resembled a god than a ferocious beast, the human soul, altered in the lap of society by 1,000 forever recurring causes, by the acquisition of mass of knowledge and errors, by the changes that have taken place in the constitution of the bodies, and the continual impact of passions, has, so to speak, changed in appearance to the point of being almost unrecognizable. Right? So the weight of history, this is crucial, because now he's already making a claim about history and the state of nature. He's linking the two, that if you want to understand the state of nature, you have to realize that it has a certain kind of there is a certain kind of history to beginning with the state of nature and ending up where we are today. So human beings in the 17th century, 18th century, when he's writing. So he understands that human nature is something that transforms and changes, and hence it is always difficult to really pin down and distill what the original human nature is. That is how human nature was. So the assumption is that there was always a first man, right? There was always the first of the human species. So his conception of human nature is to try to conceive of what life is like for the early Homo sapiens, the very early Homo sapiens, 13,000 years ago, let's say. These are creatures who are evolving from apes and live like animals, but they have no society and they have no language. So what is that original condition? So he says that this is crucial. We have to, obviously, he knows that there's no real way of having scientific knowledge about this. He accepts that all of what he's doing is a certain kind of conjectural history. But nonetheless, this is a crucial starting point. We have to really pin down on what human nature is, because everything else, all our speculations about politics, philosophy, etc., can only be derived after we have a more comprehensive knowledge about the original nature of humans, right? So now, why is that important from the standpoint of political philosophy? Because a lot rests, as we've seen already with Hobbes and Locke, on conceptions of natural law, right? Both Hobbes and Locke use that notion. And Rousseau says that these accounts are all unconvincing. These accounts are all unconvincing. Why? Because these thinkers, Hobbes and Locke, impute into the state of nature things that already presuppose the existence of society, right? Why is that? Because human beings cannot really have any conception of things like peace, property, or even have the ability to think about what an ideal kind of society is, right? So human beings, again, think about it from the perspective of Homo sapiens as they have emerged, right? The first Homo sapiens, the early Homo sapiens. They simply cannot think about things in terms of these rational concepts, okay? Why? Because they don't have language. They don't have society. They don't have things like property, etc. So it simply makes no sense. I think this is a very compelling case that for people like Hobbes and Locke, they're talking about the state of nature in terms purely that are metaphysical and philosophical, that simply is not accessible to early Homo sapiens, who don't have language, who don't have philosophy, who don't have the kinds of social bonds and relations you need in order to have things like property. Okay. So instead, Rousseau is going to say that we can only conjecture that early humans, original human nature, had only two kind of elements, right? Two kind of elements. And he says, hence, disregarding all the scientific books, this is from page 127, disregarding all the scientific books that only teach us to see men as they have made themselves. Right? So he's telling Hobbes and Locke, look, you are creating this fantasy image of the original human nature. This is not what it can be like. And meditating on the first and simplest operations of human soul, I believe I perceive in it two principles prior to reason. Prior to reason. This is important. So human nature in its original state is both pre-social, that is, and there is a very, he gives a very powerful example of family life, right? A male and female simply meet, they procreate, and the male goes away, the female rears the kid, and the kid, when they're capable of sustaining themselves, leaves the mother. So much so that maybe 2-3 years down the line, when they encounter each other, they're barely able to recognize each other, right? So they become strangers in that sense. So they purely serve a certain kind of biological function. There is no enduring social relationship amongst humans in this original state, okay? But they're also, this is consistent with Hobbes. Hobbes also believes that human beings in its original state are asocial, right? But nonetheless, Hobbes attributes to humans a certain kind of rationality. Humans have rational, calculating rationality, right? They know what they want, they know how to acquire what they want, and they're always calculating. They're always calculating, trying to discern threats, respond to it, that is most in a way that is most advantageous to them. So there are these calculating rational beings, and Hobbes and Rousseau says this is a complete fantasy. They don't have reason, they don't have rationality, they don't even have language. Okay, so human beings in the original state have only two principles. He says, of which one interests us intensely in our well-being and our self-preservation. Right? So the first one is simply this drive to self-preservation. This, again, is something that is probably self-evident, and here even Hobbes agrees. And the other, which is not quite Locke, in that it is not a certain kind of natural law which one can discern again through reason. Remember, for Rousseau, humans in the state of nature are pre-rational. So they do not have access to some kind of reasoning faculties that will allow them to arrive at this natural law, which is one of mutual reciprocity, recognition of each other's rights. So it's not a Lockean second element. He says, the other inspires us a natural repugnance of seeing any sentient being, and especially any being like ourselves, perish or suffer. Okay, this is the notion he will derive from this, is pity or compassion. Okay, so we don't like to see unnecessary cruelty or unnecessary pain and suffering. So it's not quite Hobbes. It's not quite Hobbes. You don't have a right to everything and anything. So just think about the natural world around you. Okay, if a lion sees, the lion is not always trying to go around kill deers, right? More than that, the lion also has a great deal of sympathy with members of its own species. Okay, so he's trying to make the case for, well, how can we access this original nature? And if we look closely at the natural world, we can derive from it two kinds of things that must have been there in the original human nature. One is this drive to self-preservation. I'm going to try to avoid threats, and I'm going to try to avoid things that will hurt me. But at the same time, I'm not going to be unnecessarily vindictive, cruel, and enjoy hurting other creatures around me, right? For the most part, if I can get something without trying to do harm to others, I'll try to probably do that. Okay, so these two notions play a central role in his conception of human nature. I'll come to the implications of them, but let me dwell more on this issue about it being pre-rational. Now, pre-rational, that is the human capacity to reason, to reflect, to philosophize, right? It's something that for Rousseau is dormant in human beings, right? It is latent. It is something that can only out of a series of accidental circumstances emerge, right? It is not, there's nothing necessary about it. Okay, in fact, he says at one point that man who meditates, man who thinks, is a depraved animal, right? And it is simply not possible in this state of nature, where human beings are simply a kind of biological creatures endowed with these two drives, one for self-preservation and one for avoiding unnecessary pain and suffering, a certain kind of pity and compassion. They are content in some sense with the life they live. They're content with satiating their appetite without going into a war of all against all. And then they don't need to speculate about things. They don't need to think about issues like peace or just political society or any of those things, right? So they have no reason to trouble themselves with reason, as he puts it. It's not possible to conceive why someone who has neither desire nor fears would take the trouble of reason. That's his quote. Right? Why would they take the trouble to reason? Okay. So what follows from this conception of state of nature is firstly that there is equality. There can be natural inequalities, obviously, in terms of your natural endowments, how strong you are, how fast you are, what kind of skills, what kind of natural abilities you have. But the key point is that these natural inequalities, firstly, don't matter that much. This is something that, again, Hobbes would also agree with. Right? The natural inequalities don't really matter that much. So for practical purposes, human beings are fundamentally equal. But more crucially, the depth of Rousseau's argument is that there's no linkage. There's absolutely no necessary connection between natural inequalities and social inequalities. Right? So there is something really artificial in trying to make the claim that all those who rule, all those who become politicians are virtuous or better than others. All those who are intellectuals are more intelligent than others. All those who are rich are more industrious and hardworking than others, or more creative or more capable than others. So any attempt to insert qualifications, ranks, and distinctions are always necessarily social, right? That in the natural world, natural inequalities are absolutely trivial and not consequential. So there's never any connection. There's no connection between natural inequality and social inequality. More than that, what is also crucial is that in this world, in this kind of state of nature, there is a natural innocence. There's a natural innocence of man. Why does this happen? Here he uses a notion, he doesn't explicitly state it in the text, it's something that comes out in the footnote. He uses the notion, footnote on page 218, he uses the notion amour de soi, okay, amour de soi, self-love. This is, and he will use it to distinguish it from amour propre, which is vanity, right? And his claim is that in the state of nature, human beings have this kind of self-love in that they would want to satisfy their needs, but it's a non-conflictual kind of love, non-conflictual kind of self-love, which is not contingent on the hurt or pain or let's say bad outcomes for others, right? So imagine again, you're a lion, you kill a deer, you eat the deer, you're now content, and you're just lying on the ground. You're content. You have absolutely no other needs or conceptions or desires at that point, right? Maybe a herd of deer also walk by you. You're not going to think, oh, what about feeding myself for the next 3 days? Should I go kill another deer, right? You're simply not motivated to do anything as such. That's a kind of self-love of contentment, okay? So it's a very anti-Hobbesian kind of self-love, because it involves a certain kind of capacity. It already incorporates within it the capacity of humans to have pity, okay? You're not gonna go willy-nilly kill things or destroy things because for your own aggrandizement or satisfaction of your desires. So it's a compassion, but it's a limited compassion. It doesn't mean that you're never gonna do anybody harm, but for the most part, you're gonna do the least harm that you can do in order to satisfy your needs. Right? Now, why is this? Why does this happen? Because in the state of nature, again, as he's imagining it, 13,000 years ago, let's say, when Homo sapiens first evolved into existence, is that nature is abundant, right? There's no scarcity as such. You're not really competing for resources. If you see that there's another human being eating some fruits, then you're gonna maybe just go to the next tree. Or find another tree and try to get food from there, right? You're simply not interested in crossing paths with them and killing the other and having the fruits. Right? That makes no sense. There's enough abundance for you to avoid that kind of war with another member of your species. So in this kind of natural world, and he often uses the notion of the sauvage, which obviously one can find very problematic, but in a way he's trying to play with it rhetorically, because he's saying that it is these people of modernity, European Enlightenment, who label people living in, let's say, the Americas at that time, or even in Africa, as savages. And his point is, no, look at the life of these savages, these so-called savages. They have a natural innocence. They still retain some elements of the original human quality, right? And the real barbarism, the real destructive and depraved animality is actually people in Europe, as he calls it in the social contract, the bourgeois, right? The bourgeois, the middle classes, who are so interested in competing with each other, always trying to dominate each other, right? They're driven by amour propre, that means vanity. So that happens only at the level of society. That only happens when human beings enter into society. In the state of nature, they're free of all of this. He gives a really sentimental kind of sketch of what human life is like in society. And he says, this is from the first part of the second discourse, page 139. Alone, idle, and always near danger, savage man must like to sleep and be a light sleeper, like animals which, since they think little, sleep, so to speak, all the time. They do not think. Right? Light sleeper. Self-preservation being almost his only care, his most developed faculties must be those that primarily serve in attack and defense, either in order to overcome his prey or to guard against becoming another animal's prey. By contrast, the organs that are perfected only by softness and sensuality must remain in the state of coarseness, which precludes every kind of delicacy in him. And since his senses differ in respect, his touch and taste will be extremely crude, his sight, hearing almost, and smell most acute. Okay, so this, he says, is the kind of physical condition. Entering into the condition of the savage under in a more moral and metaphysical sense. He says, but without resorting to the uncertain testimonies of history, who fails to see that everything seems to remove from savage man the temptation as well as the means to cease being savage. His imagination depicts nothing to him. Okay, so people, Homo sapiens in this condition, are simply uninterested, and not only uninterested, they simply have nothing to imagine, right? There's no imagination for a better kind of life, better kind of society. These are simply not things that they are afflicted by. These are not concerns that they are afflicted by. His heart asks nothing of him. His modest needs are so ready to hand that he is so far from the degree of knowledge necessary to desire to acquire greater knowledge, right? That he can have neither foresight nor curiosity. Okay, so this Hobbesian procedure or the Lockean procedure, that which is, Hobbes calls it the second law of nature, right? You try to imagine, you're trying to rationally think, well, is it possible for me to arrive at a state of peace, right? To escape the state of nature? And then and the imagination leads the man in the state of nature to think about a commonwealth governed by a supreme sovereign. Rousseau says that is really absurd. For man in the state of nature, who's so content with the life they lead, they're so content. They have a certain kind of self-love. They have a certain kind of compassion and pity. Of course, there's going to be violence. It's going to involve some kind of violence because ultimately self-preservation is important. You simply cannot run away from the dangers that are around you. But nonetheless, you're not troubling your mind and your soul with questions about what could be a different kind of life, what could be a better life. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about whether or not I will go hungry tomorrow. These are simply not concerns that man in the state of nature has. Right? So he says, this spectacle of nature becomes so familiar to him that he becomes indifferent to it. Right? He's not troubled by the fact that rain doesn't happen during one summer. He's not troubled by the fact that there is cold weather one day, right? So these are simply, again, not concerns. For forever the same order, forever the same revolutions, he lacks the wit to wonder at the greatest marvels. And it is not to him that one will turn for philosophy man needs in order to be able to observe once what he has seen every day. Right? His soul, which nothing stirs, yields itself to the sole sentiment of its present existence, the sole sentiment of its present existence. It's a kind of profound self-contentment, right? With no idea of the future, however near it may be, and his projects as limited as his views hardly extend to the close of day. Right? So he's taking issue with this whole conception of natural law as laid out by people like Hobbes and Locke. For Locke, for example, natural law is something that you can reason, right? You can reason, it's identical with reason. You can rationally understand. Every man is able to rationally derive and philosophically understand what the natural law is. And Rousseau says that is absurd. That is absurd because man in this nature has absolutely no reason to even think and speculate. Right? Why would you even concern yourself with the thing called natural law? If you're living in this kind of state of nature that he's described, which I believe is much more compelling if you actually look at discussions about prehistory, human beings prehistory, then it's a much more compelling picture. And if you want to get accounts of this, in fact, it would be good to look at apes. Apes who live, they might engage in violence in the sense that there might be moments of conflict between them, but for the most part, they're simply interested in getting their foods, doing whatever they need in order to fulfill their biological functions. There's absolutely no condition of state of war of all against all, and there's certainly no need for speculation about what would be a more just, more peaceable, or more just political society, right? So this is the account he's giving us. However, he finds in human nature a certain kind of flaw, right? That there is, in fact, some problem, and it's a problem that comes to derail this state of nature, which he says is something that nobody would have any willingness to exit. Again, if you have no capacity to reason, no language, no philosophy, no concerns about peace, no concerns about security, no concerns about property, possession, etc., you're simply not interested in a different kind of social order. You're not interested in society. You're not interested in living differently. Okay, that is already a question that presupposes the existence of society, philosophy, reason, language, and the rest. Okay, so nonetheless, he says that there is a difference between human beings and the rest of the animals. One is obviously the human capacity to act in ways that are more autonomous than beasts, and he calls it that man is in their capacity free agents, right? This is from page 140. He says, "I see in any animal nothing but an ingenious machine to which nature has given senses in order to wind itself up, and to a point, protect itself against everything that tends to destroy or to disturb it. I perceive precisely the same thing in human machines, with this difference that nature alone does everything in the operations of beasts, whereas man contributes to the operations in his capacity as a free agent." Okay, so human beings already have this kind of freedom, the capacity to act on their own, that is to be able to make decisions that animals don't. Animals are creatures of instinct purely, right? But human beings have this kind of freedom. But the second grounds on which he distinguishes between beasts and animals is the more important one, because it opens the door to why human beings have this kind of fall from a really content creature in the state of nature to a really depraved animal, as he says it, right? Depraved animal in society. So what makes for this kind of fall? This is, if you think about it metaphorically, there is a certain kind of biblical theological element in Rousseau. He begins with this kind of assumption about the first man who's in the Garden of Eden, in a state of nature which is perfect, ideal, harmonious, no problems, and then there is the sin, there's the sinful descent and fall. Rousseau, in some sense, is playing with that trope of argument. He's saying that in the state of nature, human beings have this kind of original natural innocence, right? The savage is in fact a very naturally innocent creature, but there is then a fall. But the fall happens not out of necessity, not out of intention either, right? Nobody who's in that state of nature is trying to think about what would be a better kind of society or a different kind of society, nor is anybody trying to escape that condition. But there is, out of a particular accidental history, as he puts it, the changes of circumstances, that one distinctive feature or element of human nature comes to, in some sense, haunt us, right? And he says this is the difference of humans with animals. This is the second grounds of the difference. He says, but even if the difficulty surrounding all these questions left some room for disagreement about this difference between man and animal, there's another very specific property that distinguishes between them, and about which there can be no argument, namely the faculty of perfecting oneself. A faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, this is a kind of accidental historical series of contingent events, right? Sequence of contingent historical events, changing circumstances, but because humans have this kind of latent faculty, the mixture of the two develops. And he says, successively develops all the others and resides in us, in the species as well as in the individual. Right? So it's something that accumulates. It accumulates in the species and all human individuals who are part of that species. Whereas an animal is, at the end, several months, what it will be for the rest of its life, and its species after 1,000 years what it was the first year of those thousands, right? So there's no evolution or transformation of human nature, of animal nature, but humans do transform themselves. Human nature does transform. And he says, why man is alone liable to become an imbecile. So why does man become imbecilic, silly, stupid? Is it not that he thus returns to his primitive state, and that whereas the beast, which has acquired nothing and also has nothing to lose, always keeps its instinct, man again losing through the age or other accidents all that his perfectibility had made him acquire, thus relapses lower than the beast itself. So this long train of human history, which is a sequence of circumstances and accidents, combined with this human faculty for perfecting oneself, transforming ourselves, improving ourselves, makes us imbecilic to the point that we are degrading, we are relapsing lower than the beast itself. It would be sad for us to be forced to agree that this distinctive and almost unlimited faculty for perfectibility, this pursuit of perfectibility, is the source of all of man's miseries. So the very source of human degradation is this kind of capacity, latent faculty we have of perfecting ourselves. But why does this transformation happen? And more importantly, the claim is that there is, through the transformation of human nature throughout history, there is a very, very serious degradation. Okay, so this is the critical element of Rousseau, contra the kind of ideology of the Enlightenment, which is about progress, right? That yes, there is transformation and there's change. There's change in culture. There's change in society. There's change in human nature. But none of this is for the good. Okay, none of this is for the good. It is in fact retrogressive. Right? So it ultimately leads him to the radical conclusion that the source of the problem is actually human society. He says on page 128, this is the end of the preface, the last paragraph, human society viewed with a calm and disinterested gaze, right? If you actually look at human society objectively, seems at first to exhibit only the violence of powerful men and oppression of the weak. Okay, the mind rebels to the harshness of the first. One is inclined to deplore the blindness of the others. And since nothing is less stable among men than those external relationships that are more often the product of chance than of wisdom, right? In the sense that they're accidents, they're accidental creations, not really intended by anybody, and that are called the weaknesses of power, wealth, or poverty, human establishments seem at first glance to be founded on the piles of quicksand. It is only by examining them closely, only after setting aside the dust and sand that surround the edifice, that one perceives the unshakable base on which it is raised and learns to respect its foundations. Okay, so human society is in some sense a corruption of the original and naturally innocent human nature. So how does this argument unfold? But before we go into that argument, let me again just drive home the point that he's making and the radical critique it presents of Hobbes. In fact, he explicitly cites Hobbes. This is from page 151. He says, above all, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because man has no idea of goodness, again, in the state of nature, there is no conception of goodness, man is naturally wicked, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue, that he always refuses to those of his kind services which he does not believe he owes them. So the picture that Hobbes paints of human nature is not correct for Rousseau, because human beings are not actually like that. In fact, that kind of sketch of a really self-interested, calculating, rational human who's also vainglorious, who's willing to kill others for glory, is something that is actually a product of society. And here he claims By reasoning on the basis of the principles he establishes, this author should have said, this author as in Hobbes, should have said that since the state of nature is the state in which the care for our own preservation is least prejudicial to the self-preservation of others, it follows that this state was the most conducive to peace and best suited to mankind, right? So that's the argument, yeah, in one sentence. This is the state of nature was the most conducive to peace and to mankind, right? Is best suited to mankind. Hobbes says precisely the contrary, because he improperly included in savage man's care for his preservation the need to satisfy, this is the crucial point, the need to satisfy a multitude of passions that are a product of society and that have laws and that have made laws necessary. So the whole attribution of an immense range of appetites that would induce men to go have rights, think that they have rights over each other's body, is itself already a product of human beings in society. Okay, and this happens because human beings develop amor propria. There is a kind of love and craving for beauty, glory, recognition, esteem, right? And this is not something that has any kind of limit. It is an infinite desire, amor propria, right? This self-love or vanity is infinite. Emile Durkheim, who's a French sociologist, writing many years after Hobbes, has a formulation: a morbid desire for the infinite, right? A morbid desire for the infinite. This is a Rousseauian notion, and he says it is reason that engenders amor propria, and reflection that reinforces it, reason that turns man back upon himself, right? So the very ability to think of your own self, to think about the I, right? To think about who I am, what my interests are, what my needs are, it already makes you something somewhat egotistical, right? And it requires society. Society is required in order for you to become egotistical. Reason that separates him from everything that troubles and afflicts him. It is philosophy that isolates him. By means of philosophy, he secretly says at the sight of suffering man, perish if you wish, I am safe, right? So it is philosophy, it is thinking, it is reason, rationality that makes human beings selfish and egotistical, okay? So this whole birth of desire for glory, for recognition, for esteem, for distinction, this is what, in fact, both creates society and actually leads to a state of competition and scarcity. So let's see what the argument is. It is important to note that actually Rousseau accepts it, that there's no real way, even though he says kind of rhetorically that here is, here, man, here is your history. He knows very much that this account of history, in fact, we can call this a kind of birth of the philosophy of history, because it is thinking about how human beings arrive at where they are. He says that it has to be necessarily based on conjectures, right? This is towards the end of part one. I admit that since the events I have described could only have occurred in several ways, I can choose between them only on the basis of conjectures, right? Only on the basis of conjectures. So the challenge is that, again, now towards the bottom of page 159, this will exempt me from expanding my reflections about how the lapse of time makes up for the slight likelihoods of events, about the astonishing power of the very slight clauses when they act without cease, about the impossibility, on the other hand, of rejecting certain hypotheses without, on the other hand, being in a position to attach to them the certainty of facts, about how when two facts given as real as they are, connected by a sequence of intermediate facts, are unknown or believed to be so, it is up to history, if available, to provide the facts that connect them. Okay, so there are two facts that are given and are real. That is the fact of human nature in the original state, that is Homo sapiens, let's say 13,000 years ago, and human beings in the state, the time that he's writing, 18th century, right? So these are two facts, and human nature, he says, has radically transformed from a state of natural innocence, contentment, right, amour de soi, to a state of competition, depravity, conflict, and a real fall. real fall of the natural innocence of human nature. So those are the two facts, and he's going to try to, through conjectures, give a account linking the dots throughout time. Okay, and the major part of the argument actually happens in the very first passage of part 2, and he says, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, this is mine. Right? So this is the Lockean claim. Locke says that in the state of nature, as long as you act on something, you have earned the right to claim that this is yours. And this is something that is a natural law for Locke, that every human being recognizes this. Rousseau says the first man who enclosed a piece of ground, who enclosed a piece of land, and said that this is mine, and found people simple enough, sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. So the very first man who encloses land and who claims ownership is the founder of society. And this, Rousseau says, is a kind of theft. You're stealing from mankind. You're stealing from the commons. He says, how many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him, spared by this original founder of civil society, who, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his kind, beware of listening to this impostor. You're lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's, and the earth's no one's. Right? But in all likelihood, things had by then reached the point where they could not continue as they were. So the original founder of civil society was the person who enclosed land, who claimed ownership of something that is purely in common. And more than that, anybody who's existing in the state of nature simply had no reason to enclose land, right? There was an abundance of resources. And more than that, there was a deep satisfaction with the things that are around them. There's no need for more things. There's no need for ownership, a sense of possession of land. Right? This again only happens through a chain of historical developments that we can only conjecture. And it involves, I will again summarize this because this is not, to our mind, the more interesting part of Rousseau's argument. But it involves, obviously, he claims a certain kind of population increase that also puts people together. It creates in human beings a need for mutual dependence. For example, speculating about hunting gathering societies, where bands of people hunt together. They learn the act of cooperation. They understand the need for depending on each other in order to actually carry out the hunt. But in that they become more efficient and more capable of hunting. So they're actually able to do the job better. But this, the paradox of it is that it allows room for leisure. Right? It allows if you, in the original state, you are living a solitary life. You're out there in the wilderness by yourself. You're hungry, you try to go hunt something, you eat, and then you're not concerned about killing things for feeding yourself tomorrow or whenever you're hungry next. But once you start building community, that is, you start associations with each other, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be formal associations, it doesn't have to involve settlement. But as long as the population increases and you're interacting with more people, you're cooperating with others, depending on others to hunt, to gather food, etc., you're entering into a kind of social life. You're both requiring the use of language in order to communicate, and you're developing also the use of reason, right? So these are, again, the kinds of arguments he's making. These are very schematic. We don't have to really, it's not central to us whether or not this account of history is correct. But the point is that there are certain things that must have happened for Rousseau in order for there to be the development of society as he knows in the 17th century. Okay, so other things that he includes instead of population increase, in addition to population increase, are things like metallurgy and agriculture. Right. So these exacerbate the need for enduring human relationships, dependency, and the use of language and reason. And nonetheless, this leads to first forms of association, which are kind of family, then broader communities. nonetheless, the crucial changing point is this enclosure of property. And the enclosure of property, as I've said, for Rousseau, is the first theft, right? It's the first theft, is the first great swindle. And then he draws out what is a major argument about the beginnings of society. This is from page 170. Here then are all our faculties developed. Okay, so this is kind of leading up to the beginnings of civil society. So human nature from the original state has changed quite a bit, transformed quite a bit because of population increase, metallurgy, and agriculture. And these are again all historical accidents. There was no teleology to any of this, right? It was not intended. It was not part of some kind of grand design or plan. It simply happened. But things take a decisive turn with the enclosure of private property. And he says, here then are all faculties developed: memory, imagination, brought into play, amor proprio, interested, reason becomes active, and the mind almost at the limit of perfection of which it is capable. Here are all natural qualities set in action, every man's rank and fate set, so not only to the amount of their goods and the power to help or to hurt, but also as to mind, beauty, strength, or skill, as to merits or talents. And since these are only the qualities that could attract consideration, one soon had to have or to affect them, right? To affect them. That is, to produce a certain performance of these kinds of things. To be and to appear become two entirely different things. And from this distinction arose ostentatious display, deceitful cunning, and to be and to appear became two entirely different things. To be and to appear. It's a claim about authenticity. In the state of nature, there is no reason for you to be concerned about how you appear to others, right? Because you have no concern about beauty. You have no concern about elegance, about being interesting, about sounding intelligent, about being very capable, right? Learning new skills, having new talents. These things are absolutely and ludicrously irrelevant if you're in a state of nature. Even natural inequalities, things like what your face looks like, how tall you are, how fast you are, have no significance. They only become significant when you enter into a certain level of social development and socialization. Socialization entails a certain degree of violence, okay, because it detaches you from how you are, because you're already always concerned now with how you appear. So underlying this is a concern about humans. This is a notion that will become absolutely important for later thinkers, especially Hegel and Marx. We're going to read Marx. This notion of alienation, right? That there's a separation between how you are and how you appear to be, right? The life you live versus how you are. There's always a division between the two. So man as an authentic being ceases to exist. So to be and to appear to be become two entirely different things. And from this distinction arose ostentatious displays, deceitful cunning, and all the vices that follow in their wake. Okay. So all the vices, ostentatious display, any kind of performance, playing social roles, etc. All of this results out of this kind of development of beginnings, is part of this beginnings of society, right? So now the implications of this argument about the splitting of the two, of being and appearing to be, are quite immense. And I would read out some of the key formulations because they're really quite dense. And he says, look at it in another way. Man who had previously been free and independent, that is, man in its original state of nature, is now, so to speak, subjugated by a multitude of new needs to the whole of nature, and especially to those of his kind whose slave he, in a sense, becomes, even by becoming their master. Rich, he needs their services; poor, he needs their help; and moderate means do not enable him to do without them, right? So regardless of how rich you become, how poor you become embroiled in this kind of dependency of relationships onto others, right? And insofar as you require this structure of social relationships around you, you have to play a social role. And it necessarily implies that you cease to be just yourself. You cease to live according to your own instincts. Okay. You have to constantly think about, well, what does this person expect from me? How am I going to perform my role for them and the rest? Okay. He must therefore constantly try to interest them in his fate and to make them really or apparently find their own profit in working for his. So you have to appeal to the self-interest and rationality of other human beings in order to live your own life. Okay. Which makes him knavish, artful with some, imperious and harsh with others, and places him under the necessity of deceiving all those he needs. If he cannot get them to fear him, he does not find a way in his interest to make himself useful to them. Okay, so this necessarily opens the door for deceit, because you develop this kind of vanity. You develop a sense of esteem, a desire for an infinite, limitless desire for esteem, glory, and recognition. And for the sake of that, which is already always mediated through structures of social relationships you're embedded in, you're going to strive for recognition, and you're going to do that by appearing to be something, right? To appearing to be something, always ready to deceive people if necessary, right? So he concludes this passage by saying, all these evils are the first effects of property and the inseparable train of nascent inequality. Now we actually have a first formulation of why the title of the essay is The Origins of Inequality. Right? So he's saying that inequality is socially produced, it is socially constructed. And the first inseparable train of nascent inequality is the first, it is created by property, right? It is created by somebody enclosing land and claiming this as their own. Okay, now on the basis of this emerges not only a very powerful sovereign state that becomes tyrannical, but also a condition of war between different kinds of states and different kinds of communities. So everything follows from this. And the implications of this nascent inequality, he says on page 172, nascent society gave way to the most horrible state of war. Humankind debased and devastated, no longer able to turn back or to renounce its wretched acquisitions, and working only to its shame by the abuse of the faculties that do it honor, brought itself to the brink of ruin. Okay. So this condition of the state of war, which is Hobbesian state of nature, he says is a result of civil society. So he agrees with Hobbes that, but he's simply saying that Hobbes, what you call the state of nature, is actually human beings as they are in society in the 17th century. Okay, that is not their nature. That is not how they were naturally. This is precisely a historically specific social reality. But the enclosures of property, right? Those who actually claim property became naturally wealthy, right? So the distinctions between rich and poor arose. And then he makes a very interesting claim. He makes the claim that the political orders, all these arguments about the need for society and need for state, need for a sovereign authority, emerged out of this division between the rich and the poor. Okay, so he says, and he says that this argument represents a great swindle, a great treacherous deceit. Okay, he says, lacking valid reasons to justify and sufficient strength to defend himself, easily crushing an individual, but himself crushed by troops of bandits. He's talking about the rich person. Alone against all and unable because of their mutual jealousies to unite with equals against enemies, united by a common hope to plunder the rich under the pressure of necessity, at last conceived the most well-considered project ever to enter the human mind. Okay. To this end, after exhibiting to his neighbors the horror of a situation that armed men of all of them against one another, that made their possessions as burdensome to them as their needs, and in which no one found safety in either poverty or wealth, he easily invented specious reasons. He invented specious reasons. I think here he's polemically arguing against Locke. No? So it's the rich people who have property who became subject to banditry, that is, revolts and attacks by the poor, who found it necessary to make an argument about the need for state and a society that is governed by a common power. Right? He told them to protect the weak from oppression, restrain the ambitions, and secure for everyone the possession of what belongs to him. Let us institute rules of justice and peace to which all are obliged to conform, which favor no one, and which in the way make up for the vagaries and fortunes by subjecting the powerful and the weak alike to mutual duties. So this is a very interesting argument, because he's saying, let's establish formal laws. So let's establish laws that are universal and general. Again, this is law. Okay, the law does not discriminate between rich and poor, but what the law does is it protects property. So in fact, it protects the rich from having property. Right? And then he says that this is a great narrative, a specious reason that actually ends up becoming successful, much less than the equivalent of this discourse was needed to sway crude, easily seduced men who in any event had too much business to sort out amongst themselves to be able to do without arbiters, and too much greed and ambition to be able to do for long without masters. Okay, so it already created in the vast bulk of humans who had no property, who had no cultivation, who did not have the access necessarily to live out their amor propria, they all were already kind of craving for a kind of enslavement. Right? They did not have the mental fortitude to think about freedom. And he says, all ran towards their chain in the beliefs that they were securing their freedom. All ran towards their chains in the belief that they were securing their freedom. For while they had enough reason to sense the advantages of political establishment, they had not enough experience to foresee its dangers. Those most capable of anticipating the abuses were precisely those who counted on profiting from them. Okay, so this is what he calls is the kind of origins of civil society, and it represents to him the swindle of the rich, a swindle of the rich. Such was or must have been the origin of society. Okay, so he knows that he can only work with conjectures. He's saying such was or must have been the origin of society. I think his emphasis is on the must have been, and of laws, which gave the weak new fetters and which gave the rich new forces, irreversibly destroyed natural freedom, irreversibly. Okay, if you were beginning to think that from this account, Rousseau wants to return to this Homo sapien at the dawn of human evolution, then that's wrong. It is irreversible. This point is irreversible. Forever fixed the laws of property and inequality, transformed a skillful usurpation into an irrevocable right. So skillful usurpation. Property was a usurpation. It is theft from the commons. And for the profit of few ambitious men, henceforth subjugated the whole of mankind to labor, servitude, and misery. You can already see here the specter of Marx. Okay, Marx is in some sense deeply influenced by Rousseau, and one cannot really make sense of Marx's whole project without having confronted Rousseau's political philosophy. But let me then summarize the kind of argument he's making here. He produces a very brief sketch of the stages of human equality. Now I'm reading out from pages 182. He says, if you follow the progress of inequality through these different revolutions, and by revolutions, he means like these kinds of historical events, the birth of property, then the production of reasons to establish state and law, formal law, and then a defense of absolute sovereign power, right? So these are the revolutions he's talking about. He says, we will find the establishment of the law and the right of property was the first term, the institution of the magistracy, the second, which is that the institution of lawmaking institutions, the conversion of legitimate into arbitrary power, the third and the last. Okay, so that the state of the rich and poor was authorized by the first epoch, the powerful and the weak by the second, and third, that of the master and the slave, which is the last degree of inequality, and the state to which all others finally lead, until new revolutions either dissolve the government entirely or bring it closer to legitimate institution. Okay, so here you already see again a complex argument, because he's tracing the history up to 18th century Europe, where what you have around him are absolute monarchies, right? And he's saying that there is a certain kind of logic to this kind of development, beginning with property, then establishment of political states, and then absolute monarchy, defense of absolute monarchy. But he also provides a certain kind of opening, which we will again confront tomorrow when we read the social contract. He says, until new revolutions either dissolve the government entirely or bring it closer to legitimate institution. Okay, so that's something that you have to keep an eye out for when we do this, when we read the social contract tomorrow. What does he mean by the legitimate institution? But now let me return to the sort of conclusion of this argument, which is that from the state of nature, where human beings have this kind of natural innocence, what you have is a long sequence of events, some of them accidental, but some of them combining with this human desire for perfectibility, gives birth to a certain vanity in human nature, transforms human nature irreversibly, such that it splits the human quality of being with a human rational creation of an appearance, right, a certain kind of profile, if you will, and that human beings are now becoming rational, calculating, and always willing to deceive each other, always never being authentic, and this represents to him a great fall. So he says, culminating in this, and it's a picture of how human nature is corrupted. He says, here is the last stage of inequality, and the ultimate point that closes the circle and meets the point from which we set out. Here, all private individuals again become equal. Okay, so he's given you an account of the birth of inequality and then the historical stages of the development of inequality. But then he says that now we are back to the original state because we are all equal. But in what sense? He says, here all private individuals again become equal because they are nothing. And since the subjects have no other law left than the will of the master no rule than his passions, the notion of the good and the principles of justice again vanish. Okay, so now we are equal only as subjects. We're all equal only as subjects. Here again, everything reverts to the sole law of the stronger. Again, he's talking about the absolute sovereign power, right? Arbitrary authority of the sovereign. And consequently, to a new state of nature, different from that with which we began in the first, was the state of nature in its purity, whereas in this last is the fruit of an excess of corruption. So in this culmination, we return to a state of nature which is a Hobbesian state of nature, where we're competing with each other, we are deceitful, we are never authentic, but we are nonetheless equal because we are equal as subjects under a master. We are enslaved. We are thoroughly, our human nature has transformed and become so degraded that we accept this condition of servitude. Again, the corruption of human nature is such that we no longer have the natural solitary freedom that we enjoyed in the state of nature. So in the face of this really pessimistic text, this is a very pessimistic text because it's an attack on human nature, and it's an attack on social, human society and history in general. It becomes difficult for us to now think about what might be the way of changing things, right? But Rousseau will make an account. It'll be a very, he will provide us an account, again, in the social contract, of how we might be able to create a different kind of social order and social reality. But it will be a very cautious one, a cautious possibility to escape this condition of corrupted human nature in the society in which he's writing. We'll see how this argument will be made in the social contract, which we'll discuss tomorrow.